Welcome to my kitchen. Are you against taking your coaster game to the next level? I see a lot of coasters out there on Etsy or Facebook Marketplace and other online outlets. What I'm going to show you today is going to take your coaster game to the next level. In fact, I'm not sure I've actually seen this on any of the sites. So why are we starting in the kitchen, you ask? Because today's inspiration comes from this copper hood. Today we're going to combine three of my favorite things in woodworking: walnut, epoxy, and real copper metal. There's a certain process that has to be followed in order for this to work. So watch this video and leave a comment down below if you have more questions, and let's get started. And already we have our first change in our typical process. Typically, when I'm working with epoxy, I don't run anything through the planer. I don't try to flatten it or nothing, unless it's really warped. The reason for that is there's a lot of waste in epoxy. When you pour epoxy, you're going to end up putting this on some sort of belt sander, router sled, something to flatten it later. You're going to be removing a lot of material from your piece. There's just a lot of waste. So I always like to have my piece as thick as possible whenever possible. The reason I'm running these through the planer is because when you're using a metal like brass or copper in our case, you have to actually pour the piece upside down. I'll show you why that's important in just a second. All right, here's my mold. The idea is that I can do one pour and then chop my coasters up into 4 equal sections once it's cured. That way I don't have to make a bunch of molds and do a bunch of pours. Now, if you're wondering why there's no Tyvek tape on this and there's no screws holding this thing together, I'll leave a link in the description below that goes over that plus 5 other mistakes that I often see people on YouTube making when they do their epoxy project. All right, let's head off to the next step. This next part is critical, so please pay attention. Okay, I've got my wood clamped into my mold. And by the way, quit using bricks, quit using bowling balls, empty paint cans to hold your epoxy down. This is a really small piece and I still clamp it. Just use clamps. Wood floats in epoxy. Now back to our regular scheduled program. The reason I planed this wood down is to make sure that it fits really flat and tight against my melamine mold. When we pour this, the copper is so heavy that it's going to sink to the bottom of our mold. Because of that, we're actually pouring this upside down. If we had any gaps or places where this epoxy could flow underneath really easy, that would result in us having to take more thickness off to get a nice smooth top. And the more you take off, the less and less copper you're going to have in your piece, because again, that copper's heavy and it's going to sink to the bottom. So when you're clamping your wood in your mold, make sure that the finished side of the wood that you want to see when you're done is the side that's facing the bottom of your mold. Next, it's time to mix our epoxy. And for this pour, we're actually going to use liquid glass deep pour. Now, I'm sure you're already typing comments down below. Ben, if I'm doing a pour under 1/4 of an inch, I can use quick set epoxy, so I don't have to wait for my project to cure for 3 days. You'd be wrong. You're all wrong. In my experience, anytime I've added copper to epoxy, it causes it to cure a little bit faster and actually gum up a little bit quicker. Because of that, I like to use the deep pour to help slow that process down. I don't know if there's any scientific fact behind this. I'm not a scientist. If I was, I wouldn't be a struggling YouTube creator. One of the reasons I'm struggling, by the way, is because I need more people to subscribe down below. So if you could help me out with that, that'd be great. But if you are a scientist and there is something behind mixing copper with epoxy that causes it to cure quicker, please leave a comment down below and let me know. Either way, I'm going with deep pour because I ain't trying to make mistakes. Now I'm just going to sit here and mix epoxy for the next 5 to 10 minutes. I'm not going to put any copper in it until I'm ready to pour. Oh hey, still mixing. All right, I've been mixing this for quite some time, and now it's time to add my copper powder. This is literally just powdered copper that you can get on Amazon. Again, I've had experiences with adding copper and having my epoxy set fairly quickly, so I like to make sure that my epoxy is really well mixed before I add my copper. Another thing I've done in the past is not add enough copper or add too much copper and it becomes gummy. You might want to experiment with little batches of this before taking this on, because this copper powder can get expensive. Finding the right ratio of copper to add is really more of an art than a science. You can also see as soon as I add it, it goes straight to the bottom there. And that's going to happen when we mix this up and put it in our mold. That's why we're pouring this piece upside down. Now Now I'll continue to monitor this like any other pour and use my blowtorch to get any bubbles out. However, you don't have to watch this quite as carefully for bubbles since our finished side is actually down and the bubbles should be rising up. Just another nice thing about doing it this way. And one expert tip that I like to do with all my projects, I like to take a paintbrush and run it over the live edge portion of my slab just to make sure that there's no bubbles that are sticking to the side of my slab. That's where I usually see the most problems. This little step saves you a lot of time and headaches. This has been curing for over a week now. Believe it or not, with my larger projects, I like to let them cure 2 or 3 weeks or longer. Here you can start to see why we poured this upside down. The epoxy on the left, where the walnut is still pretty clear. The epoxy on the right darkened up. That's because all the copper was heavy and sank to the bottom. We've got our piece of wood here with our epoxy, and I just want to call out a few things. First of all, this is the underside of the coasters, and you can see doesn't really have a lot of copper look. You can also see here on the edge how that copper really sinks to the bottom. And even though we put a lot of copper powder in this, we're only getting maybe a 1/16, maybe an 1/8 of an inch of copper buildup on our piece at the very bottom, which leaves us to our front, the side that we want. Now see how that copper's really showing. However, over here, took off just a little bit too much. So that was my mistake. I went through that thin layer of copper and now it's not going to have a copper look. I'll spare you the part where I sand for the next hour, but I am going to use this extract paper by 3M. I'll start with the 120, move up to 180, and finish off with the 220. I sanded these down to 120. I cut these on my miter saw to get them to shape. One reason I did that is because I have a saw stop, and I was worried that if I cut this copper with my saw stop, it would activate the safety feature because copper's conductive. So just one of those things you may want to think about if you plan on adding metal to any epoxy that you're doing. Next, I'll take my 1/8 inch roundover bit and put a roundover on the top and bottom edges. And for no other good reason other than I'm a YouTube woodworker, I'm going to finish my coasters off with this Rubio Monocoat. Let's forget the fact that this is really easy to apply, really easy to fix if something goes wrong, is extremely durable, and quick and easy to use. It's just because I'm on YouTube that I'm going to use this. If you know, you know. By the way, I'm using this paintbrush because you really don't need a lot of this product to get a good coverage. Next, I'll use a white buffing pad to make sure I get a good bond to all the little wood fibers. Then I'll wipe off the extra with a paper towel, and you can see that leaves a beautiful, durable finish. And there you have it, a unique set of coasters that no one else on the market is selling today. And even though it's not perfect, this coaster that has just a little bit of copper in it actually turned out pretty cool too. So what are some things that you'll be using this technique for on your projects? Let me know in the comments down below. By the way, if you want to see how I made a one-of-a-kind chessboard, click the video that's popping up on your screen right now. And as always, thanks for watching.